Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's first breakout session. You are in the Native Reads Great Books from Indigenous Communities session with Dr. Sarah Hernandez and Kendall Talmadge-Trahane. And we are so excited to have both of them here today to talk about Native Reads and all of their work with this project. And so I am going to turn it over to them in just a moment. As they are presenting today, feel free to put any questions that you have either in the chat or the Q&A section, and I will make sure that we address those at the end of today's session. All right, thank you both for being here. I will go ahead and turn it over to Kendall and Sarah.
All right, good afternoon. As Casey said, my name is Sarah Hernandez, and I'm an assistant professor at the University of New Mexico. And I'm also a longtime member of the Ocheti Writers Society, a first of its kind tribal group for Dakota, Nakota, and Lakota writers. And I worked with the Ocheti Writers Society to launch this Native Reads project, which is a national reading campaign that seeks to increase knowledge and awareness about the Dakota, Nakota, Lakota literary traditions. And so one of the questions I often got asked when presenting this project is, how did you start this, reading campaign? How did you help empower Dakota, Lakota, Nakota people to reclaim their rich literary traditions? And so I kept getting this question. And so eventually I asked Kendall to help me write an article where we could kind of outline our method and best practices and lessons learned from launching this project. And so before I get into that project too much, I actually wanted to give Kendall an opportunity to introduce herself.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. So my name is Kendall Trahane. I am a member of the Ho-Chunk Nation of Wisconsin. When I originally was working on this project, I was part of an organization called First Nations Development Institute, which is how Sarah and I got to know each other, was working together through that organization. I've since moved on, but still help Sarah with the presentations about this program because it is really important. It is a really interesting literary recovery model. And so really excited to be sharing the information with you all today. And I think, one of the other great things about this type of project is, thinking, even personally about growing up, thinking about how we saw ourselves represented in different literary traditions, looking for Native authors to read, seeing our representation in that way. I think this just kind of helps build on that and help communities think more about the authors that they have in their own communities that they could have access to.
Yeah. Yeah, so Kendall brings up a really good point. Why launch a project like Native Reads? And really the reason behind this was that neither of us, and I think not very many Native people, have seen themselves positively reflected in their textbooks or in their classrooms. We're just not present, right, in any of these settler institutions. And so for more than 200 years, Native representations have been shaped and delivered by individuals from outside our tribal communities. And so what do we mean by this is that oftentimes our people in our communities, they're misrepresented in American literature. They've been misrepresented by missionaries, anthropologists, historians, politicians, educators, writers, filmmakers, for more than 200 years. As Indigenous people, we've virtually been erased from the American literary canon. We're either completely absent in American literature, which often portrays, this land as wild and untamed until settlers came here. Or if we are present in American literature, we're portrayed as these stereotypes, like the vanishing Indian, right, who was rapidly nearing extinction, or this wild savage who needed to be tamed and civilized and shown the value of Western culture, or the stereotype of the Indian princess who eagerly welcomed settlers to this new land. And so our people have largely been omitted from the American literary canon. Or if we are included, we're reduced to these tropes or these stereotypes. And so really what we wanted to do with the Native Reads project is we wanted to reclaim our rich and complex literary traditions. For the Native Reads project, we primarily focused on the Oceti and that's primarily because I am Lakota. I'm Sicangu Lakota. And like I said, I'm a member of the Oceti Writer Society. And so we partnered with the Oceti Writer Society to help our tribal citizens reclaim control of our rich, long-standing intellectual traditions. Um, we knew that there were a number of Dakota, Nakota, Lakota writers who have written and who have published works where they are reimagining the oral tradition in these really creative ways so that they could share their knowledge and wisdom with future generations. And so as we were preparing for the Native Reads project, what we really wanted to do is we wanted to compile a bibliography of books, all the books that we could find written by Dakota, Nakota, Lakota people. And so the way that we did that is, Kendall talked about this a little bit later, but we administered a survey to Oceti tribal citizens, and we just asked, a number of these tribal members, what books do you know of by Oceti writers? And very quickly, these writers helped us compile a list of nearly 200 books by Dakota, Nakota, Lakota writers. And one of the reasons that's really so important is because I think a lot of people just automatically assume that, Dakota, Lakota, Nakota people weren't writing and publishing. And actually, I know for a fact that a lot of people assumed that. Before I came to the University of New Mexico, I taught at South Dakota State University for 3 years. And while I was there, I would often be asked, well, what books do Dakota, Lakota people write? Or, we don't include books by Dakota, Lakota writers in our classroom because they're not publishing. And so working with the Oceti Writer Society, I helped compile this bibliography of 200 books. And then I could take that bibliography to, my colleagues who were saying we didn't have this rich literary tradition. And I could tell them, look, our people have been publishing for since 1901, and we've published more than 200 books. So we have this really rich literary tradition. It's just that it's not being taught in schools, and it's not being held to the same standards, I guess you would say, as, Western white literature. And so the Native Reads Project is really trying to emphasize that we do have this rich literary tradition. It's just that it hasn't been studied or appreciated. And so, did you want to add something, Kendall? Sorry.
No, go ahead, Sarah.
Okay, sorry. I just keep talking. Feel free to jump in if so we have this really, long and rich literary tradition, but we're not being taught it in schools. Kendall mentioned, she hadn't been um, taught books by writers from her own tribal community growing up. I wasn't taught books by writers from my own tribal community growing up. Growing up, I didn't read a book by a Native writer until I was 19 years old, until I was a freshman in college. And I remember the book. It was Jim Welch. It was James Welch's book, The Death of Jim Loney. And the reason that book just really resonated with me is because I could remember reading through his book, and he starts describing the faces of some of the Native characters. And I remember him describing the face of his sister. And when he described it, immediately, like, my mother's face appeared in my head. Like, that was the first time that had ever happened to me, where I'd read a book and suddenly I could visualize somebody I knew. Because I hadn't read a book by, a Native writer who was describing our people in our communities. And so that was a really powerful moment for me when I, picked up that book and suddenly saw myself and my community reflected in that book. And so after that, I started researching more books by Native writers, but it really wasn't until I was 25 years old where I read a book by a writer from my own tribal community, from, Rosebud. And the first book that I read was Joseph Marshall's book, The Dance House. And so Joseph Marshall is one of the authors that we include in the Native Reads recommended reading list. We interviewed him as part of this project. And so I just wanted us to play this clip. He's talking a little bit about the importance of Oceti Sakowin literature and of seeing ourselves represented.
As a consequence of reading that, I began to wonder why, or if there were stories like that about us as Native people. And of course, there weren't at that time when I was in junior high and high school. There weren't. And I was wondering if anybody was doing that from our side. I didn't know at the time. I hadn't heard about people like Standing Bear, who wrote 3 books way back in the 1920s. And I hadn't heard about any Native writers. So it was disappointing for me. So somewhere along the line, maybe when I was a little older, it came to thought, well, if someone can do that, maybe I can do that too, write a book. So that's sort of how it started.
Native Reads is a national reading campaign made possible by First Nations Development Institute to honor and celebrate Indigenous writers from a specific tribe in a region. So as an Oceti Sakowin writer and storyteller, I think you've said some of this already, but maybe if you could say a little bit more about why is it important for us as Oceti Sakowin writers and storytellers to be able to tell our own stories. And so maybe if you could just kind of, I think you touched on it already, but to maybe really expound on that just a little more.
There's a lot to be said for that because, for example, the Battle of the Little Bighorn or the Greasy Grass fight, as we call it, there are over 8,000 books, articles, scholarly papers, documentaries about that one event. But overwhelmingly, probably over 95% of those books, those documentaries, those articles were done by non-Native people. And while I appreciate some of them trying to be honest and honestly presenting our perspective, they simply can't do that because they're not Native. They're not Northern Cheyenne, they're not Lakota, Dakota, or Arapaho. They're not descended from any of the people who were there at that event. Some of us were, a lot of us were. And so we have a perspective that they will never, ever have. They might listen to somebody who was there, but they're there, but anybody who, it's all secondhand in that case. So somebody who was descended from somebody who was there, either just as somebody who was there in encampment or somebody who participated in the battle, we have a very unique perspective into that one event, and that transcends into everything about us, our culture, our language, our values, our norms, everything about us, our history. We have a perspective that no one else has. So that's the most important reason for us as Lakota people, as Native people, to tell our own stories, because we can tell it frankly, we can tell it truthfully, we can tell it from an insider's perspective that no one else has.
So as part of the Native Reads campaign, we compiled a recommended reading list of writers that we thought were critical and foundational to better understanding our tribal communities. Joseph Marshall was, one of the obvious choices that we picked as one of those writers. As part of the Native Reads campaign, we also interviewed all of these writers. So we interviewed 14 writers, including Joseph Marshall. And what I really appreciate about, that clip that we just played is the fact that he emphasizes how important it is for Native people to be able to tell their stories and to be able to tell them on their own terms. And so when we developed this Native Reads project, we really wanted this project to be a community-based project. That was, we wanted all of these resources to be curated by Native people. And so this project is entirely Native-led. And I'll let Kendall say a little bit more about our community partners.
Yeah. So as mentioned in the podcast clip that you heard, this was a project that was really a partnership between the organizations listed on the screen. So First Nations Development Institute, which is actually where Sarah and I both worked when this project was launched. Sarah was on our communications team. At the time, I was working in our grant making team. And one of the tasks that I was charged with was doing our grant making trends reports and sort of doing the analysis that way of understanding the different requests coming to us. So I had some background, I guess, in doing some of the data analysis and interpretation, and which is how I got pulled into Native Reads through the surveys that Sarah has mentioned. And so I'll talk about those a little later on. But then Sarah was also involved in the Ocheti Shakowee Literary Society, which at the time was called Oak Lake Writers Society. And so they were really, such an essential partner in this program, just as far as the level of expertise and knowledge that they brought to the table concerning Dakota, Lakota, Nakota writers. And then we have a variety of resources that came out from the project. One of them being the podcasts, like the clip that we shared that was hosted through Red Nation podcast, and just providing those additional resources to, sort of share the outcomes, the 10 essential readings. There were children's books recommendations too, and we'll share them later on in the PowerPoint. But there's a whole list of resources that you can find really dedicated around this specific campaign focused on Ocheti Shakowee literary traditions. And so we'll make sure to share those later on and drop some of those links in the chat. But really, one of the things that we sort of realized as years had gone by after launching this campaign, there's a lot of really good feedback. People really enjoyed the resources, but one of the things that we realized we hadn't yet shared out was actually how we went through the process of doing the campaign and sort of launching the project and like the different steps along the way, and realizing that that was something that we should also be sharing out, so that if others were interested in doing a similar project in their communities, that they could have at least some sort of building blocks or learn from our lessons and challenges that we faced. Sarah, did you have anything else you wanted to add there?
No, I think the only thing I just really want to underscore is what makes this project really unique is that it is entirely community-led. Kendo outlined our project, but this entire project from start to end was all done by Indigenous people, which I think makes the project one really, really unique. But also it's just so important because it helps elevate our voices and our perspectives, which, like I said, have been silent so long by settler society. This was an opportunity for us to all work together and help reclaim this rich literary tradition. And like Kendall said, we hope this will be a model that other tribes will be able to emulate in replicate in their own communities as well. And so, again, one of the reasons we focused on the Ocheti Shakowee literary tradition is, I was working at First Nations. They reached out to me and asked if we could launch a reading initiative, where people would read one Native book and it would be like a common read where they could have sort of book discussions and, things like that all come together and focus on one book. But one of the things I had mentioned to some of my colleagues was I don't think it was possible to find just one book that was representative of Native people, right? There are, 574 tribes, and they each have their own unique cultures, languages, literary tradition. And so instead of finding one book that, maybe represented a little bit about all of us, I thought it was important to focus on one tribe and one literary tradition and really work with the community to reclaim and recover that literary tradition. And so because I am Lakota and because I've been a longtime member of the Ocheti Shakowee Writers Society, we decided to focus on the Ocheti Shakowee Oate. As a people, we've relied on oral stories, histories, songs, traditions to sustain our language and culture since time immemorial. We've always had this rich literary tradition. Initially, this tradition existed in oral form, And then, settlers arrived in the 19th century, and missionaries began transcribing and translating our stories into the English language. One of the big issues that arose with this is oftentimes when these missionaries transcribed and translated our stories, they mistranslated the stories. They mistranslated them as these Christian parables or these Greek or Latin myths. And so they completely distorted our oral tradition when they transformed it from an oral to a written form. Since that has happened, Chetty Shakowin have been trying to undo the damage caused by settler colonialism. We have a number of writers and scholars, beginning with Ella Deloria, who attempted to go back and retranslate our stories so that they were more accurate and culturally appropriate. That began in the 1930s. She started to reclaim and retranslate our languages, and she was the first of a number of writers who attempted to do this. And so yeah, we just have, like I said, 200 writers who've been trying to undo this damage.
Yeah, so
Yeah, go
oh,
ahead.
sorry, go ahead. Oh, okay. Yeah, so Sarah just provided some really great context of sort of how we came to the community that we focused on through the project. And as mentioned, one of the things that we realized that we could also be doing more is sharing more about how we went through the process of doing this program. And so sort of the next portion of the presentation is going to dive into a little more of that. But kind of at a high glance, some of the main things that we did for this particular campaign was really first and importantly was compiling that bibliography that Sarah mentioned of the almost 200 books that were authored by Dakota, Nakota, and Lakota writers. And that's where the Oceti Sakowin Literary Society, really played such a huge role in the, from the earliest stages of this. Was being the ones who sort of helped put together that bibliography. The next step of the process, because it was really important for us, we had this huge list now of different books authored, and we wanted to get a better sense of the actual community and how much they knew about their own literary tradition and what was also important to them as far as thinking about their community and what they felt was really important for others to know about their community. And so then the next phase of it was a survey that we essentially shared out to the community to get a better sense of those different things. And we'll share the survey results and some of the interesting results in the next few slides. And then after that, it was really taking the results from that survey, the understanding of what was important to the community, what did they feel was important to be shared, and then sort of distilling that down into that recommended reading list, which you see in all of the final, marketing promotion of the campaign, but filtering it down to that recommended reading list of what was critical and foundational to the community. And also just making sure that that was just really embedded in their values, in their own evaluation framework. And then sort of the next step was developing additional resources that could be used to pair with those books and pair with that campaign. So resources for teachers, for students, and for just in general readers that wanted to engage with the Oceti Sakowin literary tradition. So we'll share more of those again. And then, but if you do want to, really dig down into more beyond just this presentation, Sarah and I did author a journal article for the Wachowza Review that got published in 2020. So that's also an additional resource that you could look at. So as far as the community survey, we did ask some general questions just about demographic information, things like tribal affiliation, age of the participant, what state they lived in, occupations, and we did learn some interesting things from that as well. One of the one of the interesting things was, when we originally conceived of this, we didn't necessarily send it out to just community members from that region at first. We kind of opened it up to anyone to sort of share their thoughts. As we went on, we realized it really was important to get that specific community voice. So we did sort of filter out the data to just only look at information that was submitted by individuals who were part of the Ochete Shakwe Oyate. And so we ended up with about 40 survey results at the end, which we could look at. And so that's what you'll see. But some of the major questions we asked them were things like how many books they'd read by authors in their community. We were interested in who recommended those books to them. How did they find out about them? Did they encounter any barriers trying to access books from their area? What were the most impactful ones to them? What was important for them in sort of thinking about their own literary tradition and Native American literature, and why it was important to promote their own writers. So this is kind of the breakdown of who submitted from the Ochete Shakwe Oyate. So you can see that it was largely individuals in their 30s and in their 60s. We did share the survey with several different tribal colleges or colleges that had higher Native populations that were located in the region where those tribes are traditionally located. And so that probably influenced this in some way. And of course, a couple people preferred not to answer. But so in general, that's kind of where that data stood. And then this was one of the major takeaways for us, though, was really understanding the number of books that these individuals had read that were authored by writers in their community. And so you can see, there's a range of responses here. Only 10% said that they had read 0 books from their community. We actually suspect that number is probably higher because one of the things that we learned as we were issuing the survey is that there was a lot of reluctance to fill it out if someone felt like they couldn't contribute to the survey by not having read any books by authors in their community. So I'll kind of talk about it more in some of our lessons learned and challenges, but that was really eye-opening for us, I think, too, in terms of thinking about, if we were to do this again, what are some things that we can do to make people feel more comfortable in filling out a survey like this or answering questions to just help us in our general understanding of how much they know about books in their community. This was also a really telling information that came out of the survey was how respondents knew about these books. And as you can see, overwhelmingly, more than half of them said that they knew about these books through their own research or through their own findings. 58%, that's quite a lot. And then on the other side, 17% of them said they found out about them through teachers, which, you would hope that number would be higher. And so we do think, there's a lot to be said out of this, but really, I think also kind of helped with us thinking about, the resources that need to be out there and the resources that need to be provided to teachers so that they can be aware of this information and be able to pass that along. And then one of the other interesting findings was how the different barriers to access that people encountered. So, one of the things is that, or I guess the major thing is that they just didn't know about these books, which I think is very telling. But, the other high areas are, they weren't available at the library or bookstore, they weren't taught they weren't made aware of these books in school. And then another sort of unique one that the selection committee, which Sarah will talk about later, that they kind of ran into was that actually a lot of these were out of print too, or print on demand. And so that made an additional barrier as far as like, how can we get these books into the hands of community members? So just kind of reiterating some of the key takeaways that we learned from the survey that kind of influenced the project is that 10% of respondents had not read any books by a writer from their own tribal community. As I mentioned, 58% of them listed themselves as the reason that they heard of those books. One of the other things that we sort of looked at was the age of the individual and how many books they had read. And so we'd also found, and I think this makes sense, that the respondents who had read more books were more likely to be older in age, so they'd had more time to find this information out for themselves, or they might have been in teaching or academic professions. But again, I think kind of relating to that sort of capacity to be able to have the time to seek out this information in a very targeted, dedicated way. 37% of respondents said their main barrier was just being unaware that these books existed, and then 17% reporting that a teacher was the reason they'd heard of these books. So we can infer a couple different things from that. One is that these books could potentially be underused in classroom settings, or that teachers are not aware of these books themselves. But one of the things that was interesting to see, and again, it kind of came out of looking at the age of the individuals and how they responded, was that the ones that did indicate that they'd learned about these from teachers were also more likely to be individuals who were college age or recently in college. So on the other side, that could be a good indication that these books are becoming more incorporated, hopefully, into the classroom setting. So we had a selection committee that was really tasked with sort of looking at all 200 books, looking at the survey, understanding what was important to individuals, and then really narrowing down the list to the essential readings that you see on all of our web pages. I'll turn it over to Sarah to just give a little more background on the selection committee process.
Yeah. So as Kendall was saying, once we had the survey results, we needed somebody to kind of interpret, those survey results and help us narrow down a reading list that teachers and students could use in the classroom. And so I enlisted members of the Ocheti Shakowin Writer Society to help create this list. And so just a little bit of background on the Ocheti Shakowin Writer Society. We were established in 1993, so we've actually been around for 30 years. We're a network of 30 tribal writers from all different fields. Some of us are, educators. Some of us work just in all different fields. We work in all different fields, but the one thing we have in common is that we come together to think about how to preserve and perpetuate our oral traditions in print form. And so we've been around for 30 years. We've published 3 books, Hey Sapawambli, Black Hills Dream, This Stretch of the River, Dakota Responses to the Lewis and Clark Expedition, and Shaping Survival, which is a memoir about boarding schools. And so the Ocheti Shakowin Writer Society takes a lot of pride in our mission, which is to help protect and defend, Ocheti Shakowin cultures, histories, literary traditions. And so I asked the society if they would assist with this campaign to create a reading list for teachers and students that could be used in the classroom. And we brought together 6 members of the committee, myself, Laniko Lee, who is one of the charter members of the organization when it started back in 1993, Patty Bordeaux Nelson, Gabrielle Tata Yuskanskan, Joel Waters, and Tashi Youngnumpa Livermont Barando. And as you can see, we represent all different ages, experiences, and genders. And we really wanted that to be reflected in this recommended reading list that we came together to create. And so what we did to narrow down this 200 bibliography is we would meet, we would meet, I think every month, usually on on the phone because I was no longer living in South Dakota. But we would talk about all of these different books. And what we decided to do is that we needed to narrow down these books by creating, some criteria. And so we used the survey, to establish this criteria. We asked Oceti Sakowin tribal citizens, what do you think is most important when evaluating Native literature? And so using that survey data, we came up with these five criteria, these five criterias. One, if any book appears on this recommended reading list, one, it needs to be authentic. The author must be a citizen of an Oceti Sakowin nation. Co-authored texts are not eligible for consideration. And so there are a number of books by Dakota, Lakota, and Nakota writers that are co-authored, with non-Native people. But for the purposes of this recommended reading list, we and the people that we surveyed were adamant that the authors on this list had to be Oceti Sakowin citizens, and they had to have authored these books by themselves. So that helped us start to narrow down this list of 200. Second, from this survey, we really learned, and a lot of the Oceti Sakowin tribal members felt that these books should impart intergenerational transfer of knowledge. So these books should impart Oceti Sakowin cultures, languages, histories, and social values. They shouldn't just be generic books about the Great Sioux Nation. These books really should in some way impart our cultures, languages, and histories for future generations. These books should promote sovereignty. These books must protect and defend tribal sovereignty and homelands. So I think, at times there can be books that, inadvertently perpetuate stereotypes about Native people or that are these negative representations of Native people. We really wanted to make sure that these books were empowering positive representation that promoted sovereignty and the defense of our ancestral homelands. 4, these books should challenge stereotypes. Again, there are a lot of early books about, quote, the Great Sioux Nation that would romanticize our people. But we really wanted, again, positive, empowering representation. So these books couldn't romanticize, sensationalize, further exploit the Oceti Sakowin. And then finally, for the purposes of this campaign, these books had to be accessible and readable. As part of the Native Reads campaign, we wanted to make sure that readers were able to get a hold of these books. And so we only looked at those books that were still in print and that were accessible to a broad audience. And this started to really narrow down the list as well, because, as Kendall had mentioned earlier, a lot of these books were out of print, or they were on print on demand, which means that, the publisher only printed these books when somebody ordered them, or, we had some writings that were not published at all, but we couldn't consider any of those for the purpose of, this reading list. We just wanted to make sure that these books were accessible. So we used this criteria to help us narrow down that list of 200 books to 10 books. And so what you see here is the recommended list, the recommended reading list. There are 10 books on this list. Joseph Marshall's The Lakota Way, Ella Deloria's Water Lily, Charles Eastman's The Soul of an Indian, Josephine Wagner's Witness, Ed Valandra's Not Without Our Consent, Vine Deloria's Custer Died for Your Sins, Elizabeth Cookland's Anti-Indianism in Modern America, Lydia Whirlwind Soldier's Memory Songs, and Nick Estes' Our History is the Future. So we created this recommended reading list. In addition to creating this recommended reading list, what we also did was we created this literary timeline. Oh, could you go back 2 slides, Casey? Thank you. So we created this story keeping timeline, and what we try to do with this timeline is we try to show that each one of the books in this collection was building upon the book that preceded it. So for example, you can see on this timeline, it's split into time immemorial, pre-colonial period, settler colonialism, sovereignty and self-determination and, the future. And the reason we arranged these books this way is we really wanted to emphasize that the Oceti Sakowin literary tradition is very much a tradition, right, in which these authors are building upon the work of the writers who preceded them. And so we start with Joseph Marshall because he often writes about the oral traditions and the lessons that he learned from his grandparents. He's one of the first and most prolific authors in the Oceti Sakowin literary tradition to do that. And so we thought his work was representative of the oral tradition. And then we have Ella Deloria's Water Lily, which is probably the most popular book on this list, but she writes about, the pre-reservation era. Then we start to look at settler colonialism and a lot of the boarding school writers, who were writing during this period. Charles Eastman being one of the most well-known writers. But there were also writers, boarding school writers in here who didn't have their work published until much later. So earlier I had mentioned that oftentimes the work of our writers is silenced or, erased from the American literary canon, or it's ignored. And so some of the writers on this list, like Ella Deloria or like Josephine Wagner, their work wasn't published until after they had, passed away. It was not published during their lifetime. Why? Because of the racism and sexism that existed in settler society when they were trying to write and publish. But scholars went back and they recovered these works, fortunately, over the past couple of decades. And so we were able to include these writers on this list. But one of the really powerful things about all of these collections is, right, again, they're perpetuating Oceti Sakowin culture, language, values, traditions. And so next slide, please. And so we have this long period of settler colonialism, of boarding school writers who were negatively, impacted by, the boarding school era. But in the 1970s, we start to see an era of sovereignty and self-determination, where a lot of Native writers and scholars began to reclaim in our literary traditions. So the examples we have on this list are Vine Deloria Jr., who is often considered the father of, Native American studies. He helped usher in that entire movement of sovereignty and self-determination. We have Elizabeth Cook Lynn, who actually founded the Oceti Sakowin Writer Society back in 1993 and was a fierce advocate for the Oceti Sakowin literary tradition, and worked closely with Deloria and a number of other Native scholars to establish this movement of sovereignty and self-determination in our universities. So in addition to, Deloria, Cook Lynn, we also have Lydia Whirlwind Soldier, who is another charter member of the Oceti Sakowin Writer Society, and she published this beautiful book of poetry that is difficult to get. It's only available at a handful of bookstores, but it's a really beautiful piece we wanted to include. And then, of course, toward the future, we have newer Oceti Sakowin writers, Nick Estes, who wrote Our History is the Future about the Dakota Access Pipeline, and Layli Long Soldier, who wrote Whereas, this beautiful book of poetry that pays tribute to our people. And so with this timeline, we really wanted to emphasize that our people are still, writing and publishing and helping preserve and perpetuate our traditions today. And so we hope that teachers and students can use this resource to really learn more about the rich and complex Oceti Sakowin literary tradition. The last thing I want to say about this particular list is it probably is more for high school, college-age students, probably for teachers to learn about the literary tradition. But we also realized that we needed to create a list for younger audiences. And so in addition to this, longer list, we also came up with a list of recommended reading for younger audiences, which include Virginia Driving Hawks Snavy's collection of short stories, Grandpa Was a Cowboy and an Indian, Tashunka, A Lakota Horse Legend by Donald Montalou, Greet the Dawn the Lakota Way by S.D. Nelson, My Indian Boyhood by Luther Standing Bear, and then I think my favorite book on the list is Peta Shows Me See the Light, which is a newly published book by Jesse Taken Alive Rencounter. And so we realized that, to really learn about and engage with the Oceti Sakowin literary traditions, we wanted our students to start really young. And so we hope, elementary school teachers will bring these books into the classroom as well. And so Kendall dropped all of the links to our resources in the chat box. So because Native Reads was a community-based campaign, and it was developed with a number of different organizations, our resources are kind of spread out in different areas. We created this educational booklet, which we have hard copies of, but you can also find online, firstnations.org. On the First Nations website, you find the Native Reads educational booklet. You find the recommended reading list for children. You find discussion guides for all 10 of these books. And so what the Oceti Writers Society did was they created discussion guides to go along with each one of these books, so that teachers would have that resource in the classroom to help guide student discussion. The bibliography, the list of 200 books is posted on the Oceti Writers website. So we have that link there. And then the podcast interviews were produced by the Red Nation. And so those podcast interviews are posted on the Red Nation website. The last thing I want to say about that, these particular sources is the podcast interviews are really intended as a pedagogical tool to help teachers in the classroom. So you're not just reading and discussing the book, you're also hearing from the authors themselves or from their descendants. What we decided to do is, we have the authors who are still living, we decided to interview them. Members of the Oceti Writers Society interviewed those authors. If the authors had already passed, we interviewed some of their descendants. And I think those are some of the richest materials in that came out of the Native Reads Project, are these direct interviews where authors are able to speak for themselves.
Yeah, and Sarah didn't mention it, but actually I really like going to the Oceti Writers Society resource page, because they also have links dedicated for each book that's listed as those top 10 essential readings. And then within each specific page link for that book, like they'll have, if the podcast was done for that book, they'll have a link to the podcast there. So I really do think that they have, of the three, probably the most comprehensive collection of all of the resources together that were produced through Native Reads. So then, as far as some best practices and lessons learned that sort of came out of this, that Sarah and I have been reflecting on, well, I think probably the most important one, and I know Sarah emphasized this at the beginning, that this was an entirely community-led and community-driven campaign. So community-led in the sense of, we had our advisory committee, which was the Oceti Literary Society, that was composed of different tribal elders, educators, and other community leaders that really helped sort of shape and pave this program. And then, but in general, it was really community driven, in the sense of, we were really interested in getting the community's thoughts about different things, about their interests and their needs, as far as this literary tradition. And so having that survey was really essential and important. As I mentioned, one of the things that I think we learned is that, for the purposes of this campaign, we were sort of limited in our time frame of being able to launch that survey and sort of keep it open, and waiting for feedback. We did different things. We had or incentives, I guess, for filling out the survey, things like that. But I think, one of the things, if you were to do something similar in your community, it would be really important to think about the timing of the survey, and also making sure to go to community events and really just lowering the barrier, in a sense of getting information from the community about their specific needs and interests as it relates to literary tradition. The other thing that was really important was fundraising, because we realized that we're asking people to dedicate a lot of time, especially the advisory committee, to commit their expertise, and sort of think through these different things and develop these additional resources. And so we were intentional about wanting to make sure to pay our advisory committee for their expertise. We also needed funding for purchase of books, since that was a really important part of the selection committee, was that they actually met and they read all of the books to try and narrow down to that specific list of top 10. And so being able to think about having the funds to do those kinds of things is really important in launching a project like this. And then the last big thing was community engagement. Just making sure that we're sharing out about the project, sharing these books with the community specifically. So not just the general public, but the community themselves through targeted social media, book clubs, school events, book drives. I'm just making sure that all of the outcomes of this really came back full circle to come back to the community and meet their needs.
Yeah. And one of the things I will say that I really love about this project is I feel like the Oceti Sakowin Writers Society really has done that. Yes, they were great in helping us, narrow down this reading list and creating this literary timeline and all these other resources. But I think what I'm most proud of is the fact that so many of these committee members are still actively promoting Native Reads today. And so they have started online book clubs, or they started small book clubs in libraries in their own communities, and so they are still actively sharing these materials with the community, which is really what we wanted them to do. And I know one of our elders, Patty Board Nelson, she often talks to me about her book club that she'll have, and she's seeing positive changes within the community, because it's not just Native people who are part of her book club, it's some non-Native people too who needed to learn about the Oceti Sakowin and about the people whose land they occupy. And she said it's just really had a very powerful impact on her and on her community. And so I love that the Oceti Sakowin Writers Society has continued to support these efforts, even though we've already published these materials. Now they're actively out in the community sharing them, which I really appreciate. And so if you have any other if you want to get in touch with us or talk about how to start a similar initiative in your community, I hope that you'll reach out to Kendall and myself. Here's our contact information. And really, I do hope that people do start to replicate this project in their community. So I think it's important. I think that every single one of our tribes has its own rich, unique literary tradition. Settler colonialism, destroyed a lot of our traditions, but they didn't completely destroy them. I think that we have a number of Native people who have worked hard over the past 200 years to reimagine and reclaim our literary traditions in print form. And I hope that, more people will start to honor and celebrate those literary traditions, because I think there is so much that can be learned from them. And so I really do hope that more tribes start to replicate this in their communities as well. So thank you. Any other final thoughts, Kendall?
No, just it was a real honor and joy to be able to support this project, and I learned a lot, just going through the process. So yes, grateful for everything that came out of it, and just echoing Sarah and saying that I hope that this can be a resource to other communities, and that other communities will be able to replicate or do something similar for their own literary traditions.
Thank you both so much. Lots of thank yous in the chat, lots of interest in the chat in doing this work in their communities as well. If anyone has any questions that they would like to ask Sarah or Kendall at this time, you're welcome to put those in the chat or the Q&A section. I'll wait a few moments to make sure that there are no questions, and I can read those out if you do have any questions. Also, at this time, you should be able to take the survey as well. So if you don't have any questions, you can click that survey button on the session platform to take the survey for this session. And I did just want to take a second to point out again that if you would like to access like some of the documents and resources that you've seen today, those links are on the session page on the left-hand side. So if you scroll down to the bottom, under links, you should see the full Native Reads study, the document, the timeline, and the podcast and the educational booklet, and all those things are linked there for you to access. So you can do that. And then there's also a PDF of these slides under resources as well. So if you'd like to download those so that you have contact information and links, you're welcome to do that too. I don't see any questions. If there are any questions as we're closing out, then I will make sure to pull them out. So what is next? You guys have roundtables. Those will start at 2:40, I believe, is the start time there. And you can also take the time after the session to chat on the discussion board, to download files from the resource library. If you have questions or follow up at any point throughout the conference, anytime today, you're welcome to reach out to the TA team at oie@seiservices.com. And then also just one other note before we close out. If you want to rewatch this presentation, or if you were sitting here and you're like, oh, there's somebody in my organization that was not able to be here today or was in a different session but would really benefit from hearing this information, then this session will be up on the platform for you all to go back and watch after this. And then eventually it will also be on our OIE Technical Assistance Team YouTube page as well. All right, well, if there are no further questions, then, okay. If there are no further questions, then you all are welcome to go to the discussion board, the resource library, head to your roundtables, and just another Wado thank you to Kendall and Sarah for being here today and taking the time to share all of this with us. Really lovely work.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.